Now, finally getting to the sermon this week. We're in the book of Kings, 1 Kings. So if you guys want to turn, I think it's page 280 if you have a pew Bible. If you don't have one, you can reach under the chair in front of you. And if you don't have an ESV, it may be on page 280 or it may not. But it's going to be somewhere close to there probably. We talked about 1 Kings chapter 1 last week. Pastor Brandon got us off to an awesome start. And just as we're going to be in chapter 2 this week, just as kind of a reminder, I want to quickly sum up what happened in chapter 1. We find King David in a kind of in a different place than we're used to dealing with David. David is usually seen as kind of a warrior or this powerful, mighty figure, and we find him at the beginning of chapter 1 to be old and weak and cold and extremely vulnerable. And we find the kingdom of Israel to also be very vulnerable at this point. David, although he got an amazingly good start, he was God's chosen anointed man. He began to lead the nation well. He had begun to make some missteps, and he didn't really live up to the standards for a king. And he's allowed his sons to absolutely run amok and create just an embarrassment and a mess. And at this stage in his life, that's where we see him. David's done very little to deal with the mess that he's created because of this stuff. And you find the kingdom at its utmost point of vulnerability. Brandon also shared last week that at some point in the past, I'm not exactly sure, but well prior to the events of chapter 1 and 2, David had been shown by God. God had told David who the next king should be. The next king should be Solomon. And that's a little strange because in this culture, again, that would go to the oldest son, but the oldest son had been killed, and the next son had been killed, and really the oldest living son, Adonijah at this point, wasn't the chosen one. It was Solomon. It was Solomon, evidence of one of David's greatest sins. And that's who the kingdom would go to, and we see God's grace working in that, but we see kind of a hornet's nest in chapter 2, chapter 1 and chapter 2, where the king is vulnerable, he's weak, and really the nation of Israel is vulnerable and it's weak. But at the end of chapter 1, things seem to have been solidified as a kingdom. David's oldest son Adonijah had tried to take the throne, but the prophet Nathan and Solomon's mother Bathsheba had approached David, and David had done the right thing. He had stood up for what was right. He had finally stood up to solidify the kingdom, and he appointed Solomon to be king there. And so Solomon becomes king, and Israel as a nation kind of responds with joyful praise. And even Adonijah, he had sworn his loyalty to Solomon by the end of chapter 1. But all is not well as we open chapter 2. Let me read verse 1 to you. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I know I'm kind of leaving you at a little bit of a cliff edge there. We'll come back to what he actually says. But the point is, King David, this powerful pillar of Israel, he's at the end of his life. He's in his last days. He's at the doorsteps of death. And while he has ensured that the proper king is on the throne, there's some unfinished business to attend to. And if chapter 1 is about making sure the right king gets on the throne, chapter 2 is about something entirely different. It's actually about the security of the kingdom. It's about establishing the kingdom and protecting it from its vulnerability. And that's what David is going to pull his son Solomon aside. And before he dies, he knows that he wants to share something that is of most important value with him right here. And that's really your first fill in your notes if you're taking notes. The most important thing we can pass along to the next generation is how we are to live. So King David, his kind of final days on the earth, he calls his son. And in verses 1 through 9, we get to see, really 2 through 9, we get to see a clear picture of what David values to be most important. And it's kind of split up into two parts, though. The first part's in verses 2 through 4, and the second part is 5 through 9. We'll break them up that way. But let's read verses 2 through 4, and we can see the first thing that David is calling Solomon to give attention to. I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, and that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. There's a lot at stake here. There's a tremendous amount at stake here. The line of the kingdom through David is at stake here. The security of the kingdom of God is at stake here. Solomon's own safety is at stake here. Remember why Nathan and Bathsheba actually went to David? It's because they saw the writing on the wall. And if Adonijah goes to the throne, there goes Bathsheba and Solomon for sure. There's a lot at stake. And the first one here is it's just very clear. David is trying to tell Solomon, you need to live in accord with God's standards. And that's your first number here. And again, there are two things that we need to do to make sure that the kingdom, so to speak, is secure. The first is we must obey the standards of the Christian life. And we have to live the way God designed this life to be lived, or there's a price to pay. There's a significant price to pay. Obedience is so much more important than I think we treat it in our modern day culture. I think we've kind of relaxed ourselves a little bit on teaching obedience. But if we don't obey, it's going to cost us something. There are consequences to our lack of obedience because there is a way that we're supposed to live. And as I throw up this verse back on the screen with a couple of things highlighted, you can see really clearly. David's advice here is clear. Be strong, show yourself a man, keep the charge of the Lord. And he's clear about what is essential to accomplishing this. Walk in his ways, keep God's statutes, keep God's commandments, keep God's rules, keep God's testimonies. That repetition there is for a reason. It's not redundancy, it's significance. He's highlighting what's most important. And David is clear about the results of accomplishing this, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, and that God will maintain his promises to you. Basically, again, David is saying, live according to God's standards, and you'll be blessed. Live the way you're supposed to, and there's going to be a grace and a blessing to your life. And that's very clear. And it sounds like a great deal to me, if we can pull it off, but if you think about David, he didn't do a great job pulling that off, right? His lack of obedience, his lack of initiative, his weaknesses turned into disobedience, and that disobedience created vulnerability in the kingdom. And vulnerability in his own life, again, at the beginning of chapter 1, he's so weak, he's so unable that they even had to bring someone to lay with him just to keep him warm enough to stay alive. Different picture than what you want on the throne, right? And the kingdom was a picture of David, a vulnerable place. When we live the way God calls us to, there's just a grace to things. Everything doesn't go perfect, but God blesses us in that. Our obedience leads to blessing. And when we don't, we end up in a mess, and that's just how life works. I remember, my childhood, I grew up in a really volatile home. My dad was a workaholic and an alcoholic, and he worked 7 days a week because he worked in a factory, and that's just what you had to do. And he was very clear. That was one of the ways he loved our family. I'm working this hard so you don't have to. But he was always gone. And then the difficulty of his life and his own weaknesses led him to turn to alcohol as a means to cope with how tough things were. And then my mom was codependent, volatile, and a fiery little Southern woman. And you put those two together, it leads to a pretty combustible situation. And so our house was kind of like a ticking time bomb. And I know technology, you have these little tiny speakers that can blast the whole room. We didn't have those we had the big stereo speakers. You remember those? You get they're this big around, and they didn't. Yeah, that's what I had going on. And so when things were going crazy between my mom and dad, I would go to my room and turn my stereo up, just to that point before they would come and tell me to turn it down, and I would just lay in front of the speaker. And I would just try to let the music just wash away the volatility that was going on in the other room. And usually I would just sit there. Sometimes I would pray, but I remember particularly the summer between my junior year and my senior year in high school. And I don't know what drew this out of me. We didn't go to church a lot. You kind of are Christian by the grandfather clause in South Carolina, you the Bible Belt. And I didn't take it terribly seriously, but I don't know what drew this out of me, but what came out of my mouth in a kind of prayerful cry out to God is, God, if you give me a platform to speak for you, I'll speak. And at the same time, I was, this is a parallel piece to this story. I was a pretty horrible athlete. I was slow and small and not real strong. I had zero athletic accomplishments at this point. And you can call me a late bloomer if you want to, and that's fine if you believe that. But all I'm saying is literally in the months right after this prayer, something happened. And I began to massively change as an athlete. And over the course of a couple of years, I had surpassed pretty much all of my classmates and was playing in college. And so I did what everyone does when they're blessed with an awesome gift and a platform, is I decided to forget the gift giver and use it for myself, right? That's what you're supposed to do, right? So I tried to see, whoa, this is awesome. People just they kind of like me being around. This is easy. And so I started massaging life for everything I could get out of it. And I started conceding these things up here. This way of life that I knew was wise, and I got away from that. And I started to build a mess. And some of that mess is stuff I'm still trying to clean up now. When we disobey, it just leads to problems. And as I put this sermon together and just thought through my life and thought through the mistakes that I've made, and even though I've been a Christian for blah, blah, blah years and a pastor and all, I still have part of that mess that follows me around. I still have consequences, natural and otherwise, that have come from my poor decisions. And I am sure that King David, as he was about to call his son Solomon for this talk, this father-son talk at his deathbed, I'm sure he was replaying his life. I'm sure he was thinking through his mistakes and his failures. And I'm sure he was thinking about all that it had cost him, what it had done to his family, the turmoil and chaos and utter tragedy that resulted, largely because he didn't deal with things as he should have, and he didn't live for the Lord. So David, again, this is his last moment. And he's trying to share what's most important to his son Solomon, and he says, live the way God commanded you to. Follow God's ways. Follow God's commandments. Follow God's statutes. Follow his rules. Listen to his testimonies, son, because it matters. And he knew that there was still a mess there. And so while this is a great picture, one that we're familiar with kind of just in life, is one generation passing on wisdom to the next. A father, in this case David, passing on to his son Solomon how to live. David is also a great king. So he has something else to share with Solomon. David's created a mess, and he doesn't have the ability in his time in this life to clean it all up. So he's going to have to turn it over to Solomon. As we look to verses 5 through 9, it points to this second thing that Solomon needs to give attention to and that we can give attention to. We must protect the kingdom and our lives from its enemies. David's mess had created challengers to the throne. It started with his oldest son, and now it's all the way down to his oldest living son, Adonijah, who has just made a power play for the throne. And seemingly, he's come under the authority of the new King Solomon. But we'll see how that plays out in a moment. But David has some loose ends he needs to tie up. So let's look at verses 5 through 9 and see exactly what David has in mind for Solomon. Moreover, verse 5, you also know that Joab the son of Zeruiah, what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on his sandals on his feet. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. Hey, Solomon, you're wise. You use whatever methods you want to. You do whatever you want to. But you make sure that Joab pays for what he's done. You make sure you tie up this loose end, son, because he's still a problem, and he's never not going to be a problem. So whatever you choose, do, but make sure that he pays. In verse 7, but deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table, for with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom, your brother. Verse 8, and there is also with you Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day when I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now, therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you shall bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. So, you have bookended these two folks that need to be dealt with harshly, and right in the middle, you have this case where the sons of Barzillai had really blessed David and his men when David was running from his son Absalom. So he wants them to be dealt with favorably. He wants Solomon to even invite them to the table of fellowship and treat them as his own, which is an immense honor for the king to do that. He's saying, commend them for the good that they've done. But these other two, Solomon, you're wise. I trust you. Whatever method you choose is fine, but deal with them because they're a problem. And they're part of the mess that was created by David's disobedience, and he didn't have time to deal with it himself. He couldn't, or he wasn't able to get it done himself. So David's dying message then to his son is live the right way and know that they're enemies. They're enemies to the kingdom of Israel. They're enemies to your own security, and you have to deal with them shrewdly. And then David dies. He's lived his life passionately for the Lord, a man after God's own heart, the anointed king. But he created a mess. And so on his last words, he's pleading with his son. You got to live the right way. And you got to deal with these issues. In verse 10, then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. It seems like everything's great. Hey, I told you how to do it. You're the king now. We got the right guy on the throne. And it's time for me to go to be with my fathers. Everything is firmly established, it seems. And then the rest of the chapter, which we're just going to kind of gloss over, is a picture of Solomon getting to try this out. Getting to try to take David's advice. And so, again, David started well, had some crazy years in between, and he stepped up at the end to secure things, to make sure the right person's on the throne, and make sure that the kingdom was set in a direction to pursue security. And so Solomon, his dad dies, he is the king, and now it's time to act. So he takes David up on his words, and Solomon says, you know what, but before I get to your list, David, I got a couple of people on my list too. So the first one is Adonijah, and this is a bit of a strange little story in the middle here when Solomon begins to deal with these opponents to the kingdom. Adonijah did the same thing that the prophet Nathan did. He tried to use a point of vulnerability for David, Bathsheba. Nathan knew that when Adonijah made his play to become king, that meant that everybody that opposed him was probably not going to be around much longer. So he went through Bathsheba and reminded her to remind David, so they could remind David together, that God actually said Adonijah's not going to be king, Solomon's going to be king. And Adonijah, at this point, when he sees the writing on the wall, Solomon is king, he knows something's going on, so he goes through Bathsheba as well. But this time, to try to make Abishag, the beautiful young woman that was selected at the beginning of chapter 1 to help warm King David, his concubine, so to speak, he wants to take her as his wife. Now, you can say this is just an idiot move part on Adonijah, or you could see it as how culture would probably see it, which is a clear play for the throne. If you tried to get the wife or the concubine, those close to the king, as your wife, that meant you wanted the throne too. So Solomon certainly took it as such. And Solomon rebuked Bathsheba when she brought this question to him, and then he basically sentenced Adonijah to death. And then he moves on to Abiathar, the priest, who had supported Adonijah, who had tried to help him out. And Abiathar, the priest, had done a lot of great things in the kingdom. He had supported David. He had been a vibrant part of the priesthood. But when the mess began to build up, it affects a lot of people. So he ended up on the wrong side. But Solomon does show him some grace. He strips him of the title of priest, so he revokes his priesthood, but he allows him to live, so he shows grace with him. But now he's going to get on David's list, and he starts to go after really the most dangerous to them, Joab, the military leader, who was just ruthless. He was absolutely ruthless and reckless, and he needed to be dealt with. He needed to be dealt with years ago, but he wasn't, and now he's a huge threat still. So Solomon goes after him. And the funny thing is, Joab does the same thing that Adonijah did. So back in chapter 1, Adonijah, he recognizes Solomon as the king, so he goes to the tabernacle, he grabs the horns of the altar, and he pleads for sanctuary. And it was given to him in that moment. So Joab's like, maybe that worked for me. So he runs to the tabernacle, grabs the horns of the altar, and kind of pleads for that sanctuary. But it doesn't work for him. He was a vile and evil, wicked man who could never be trusted. So he was given the death sentence. And then Solomon finally gets to Shimei. There must have been something about this man that David just didn't trust. David had basically pardoned him from a punishable offense that could have rightfully given him death. This Shimei had just chastised and taunted and cursed David and his men when they were on the run from Absalom. But David pardoned him, but he just must have never trusted him. So he warns Solomon about him, and Solomon tries to show him some grace as well. Solomon he ends up putting him on house arrest, essentially, or confining him to Jerusalem. He couldn't go beyond the boundaries of Jerusalem. And Shimei agreed to those kind of constraints. But 3 years later, David's intuition ended up coming to fruition, and Shimei leaves Jerusalem to go chase after two of his slaves that had escaped, and he's caught, and he is brought before Solomon, and Solomon puts him to death because he didn't live up to his conditions. And at the end of verse 46, the end of the chapter, we see that the kingdom is secure. We get the same sort of picture that we got in verse 12. And in verse 46 at the end it says, so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. He had done it. Solomon's first opportunity to exercise his muscles as king, and scholarship goes back and forth on exactly what Solomon's motives are at this point. But regardless of whether you think Solomon was too heavy-handed or not, one thing is clear. He has secured the kingdom. He has protected the kingdom from its enemies. David's hope for his wise words in his last moments of life, they'd come true. Solomon had done this. And this is a great story. It's kind of a wild story. But what do we do with it? Circa 2018 in El Segundo in the South Bay. What do we do with it in our own hearts? I think David's advice rings perfectly true today. We need to keep what's important important. How we live is immensely important. We can take David's wise last words to Solomon and live them ourselves. We need to know that living according to God's standards is the wise thing to do. It's how we're actually going to get the most out of this life. It's how we bring God glory. It's our only right response to a holy God that created the universe and everything in it and did everything necessary that we could live with him in eternity. That's the only right response. But we also can heed David's advice to protect the kingdom from its enemies. And I know we're not in a setting like 1 Kings chapter 1 and 2 where we have this chosen king above us. But we do have the kingdom of God at stake. And there are many challengers to the kingdom of God, to its ideals, to its truth. And so we need to stand up and protect that. And that starts in our own hearts. I need to protect the kingdom of God in my own heart from whatever those enemies may be. And there are many, whether it's our thought life or different habits and hobbies and things that we partake of, or different influences we have in our life. They can be challengers to our own kingdoms, to the kingdom of God reigning in our own hearts. And so we need to do our best there. But I want to finish this up this morning. I want to spend the rest of our time, and I just want to share a couple of implications for a life disobeying that stuff. And then I want to land us on what I think is a pretty clear conclusion. So the first implication, and it's there in your notes, when we disobey, we make a mess and someone has to clean it up. That's just life. I mean, it starts when we're little, and we keep it going forever. We might manage it, massage it, and put a rug over it and all that good stuff in our lives. But when we disobey, we make a mess. For David, that mess destroyed his family. Had David been faithful to God's ways throughout, early on, and continued that consistently, I assure you that his family would not have looked the way it did. There would be missteps, there would be problems, but it would not have looked like the utter horror of David's household. In my own life, I have spent the last 30 years trying to clean up some of the mess and untangle some of the knots that I've created from my disobedience. And I'm sure all of you guys can attest the same thing. When we disobey, when we don't live according to God's standards, we just make messes. And kind of going a little further in the same direction, the second one here, when we disobey, it does not affect God's faithfulness to his promises. It actually affects our enjoyment and fulfillment under them. No amount of disobedience on your part is going to stop God from carrying on his great plans of reconciliation and redemption. You don't have it in you. No amount of disobedience on your part is going to stop God from creating the new heavens and the new earth and ushering in a time for eternity where the people of God get to be with God fully, apart from any distractions, apart from any limitations. Nothing you do is going to get in the way of that. But your disobedience can cause a bunch of problems. For those of us who completely reject God and his standards, we'll never get to experience the kingdom because you can't experience something you're on the outside of. We have to understand that God's standards, and I get it. Sometimes the rules of the Christian life seem to be just that. Sometimes they seem archaic. Sometimes you feel like you deserve to do something another way. Sometimes you feel like maybe stuff the current culture is saying is right, and it makes us want to not trust God and his standards. But the truth, the moral truth of Scripture just continues to come back. It continues to come back because it's something God put in place, and it's unchanging, and it's for your good. If you go out this week and you run across someone who is bold enough to proclaim that they do not believe there's any such thing as moral standard out there, you should just slap them in the head. Unless they're a lot bigger than you. You should probably just pretend that you did it and think about it. You should just do it. Yeah, I would never want to do that to somebody that said that, right? So the point is, we know in ourselves that there is a moral standard out there, and we know that it's real, and we know that it's secure, and we know there's parts of it that are timeless and unchanging, because if you get slapped in the head for no reason, you know something wrong just happened. It's just a base response, right? That's not right. I got hit in the head. I didn't do anything. That's wrong. We know that. The problem is we just can't get more than a couple people in a room to agree upon what that standard is, right? That's the deal. We all know there's a moral standard. We all know that ethics is a real thing. We just don't always know exactly how to get at it. So we devote so much of our emotion and our reason to try to determine what exactly is that moral standard. But here's the problem. Although humans are pretty awesome, God created us in his image and all that good stuff, we just aren't that smart. We aren't. We don't have the ability to figure out what's ethically right for all of life. We don't. But God has already put it in place. And that's why that stuff keeps coming back around, because it is timeless. Because God determined it in itself. And so we need to be people who respond to that with obedience, because if we don't, we're not going to affect what God's going to do, but we're going to affect our ability to enjoy it and be fulfilled by it. Because we'll spend the rest of our lives, if we're going to disobey and run from God's standards, just running into the wall. We will. Because you can't massage this life to get out of it what you want. But you can live according to the way it really is, the way God designed it. And you can enjoy, even in the midst of problems and issues and failures and all that stuff, you can enjoy the kingdom. You can enjoy God's presence. You can enjoy all that this life has to hold. And I think that just brings us to kind of a logical conclusion to this whole thing. The only true security is found in God's will. The only security. You cannot protect yourself in this life perfectly. You can't. Maybe I knew that was right before I became a parent. But once I became a parent, my motivation to make life safe changed. And my realization of how limited I am to make that happen was real clear to me. I cannot create this atmosphere, this environment, this bubble to make things perfect. I can't. But what I've come to embrace is the fact that if I seek the Lord and his kingdom, if I seek God, if I seek to participate in what the Spirit's doing in my own heart and what the Spirit's doing in culture and what the Spirit's doing in this church and what the Spirit's doing across the world, if I do that, there's a grace. Things aren't perfect. But there's an intrinsic security. There's an established kingdom I get to participate in and be a part of and enjoy and be fulfilled by. But I have to set myself towards the Lord. Your only security is going to come in the Lord. If you really think about this life, that's what sets Christianity apart from everything else. We get to rely not on how we can work life to get what we want out of it. Not on my ability, but on God's ability, despite me, and despite you. And so if you've never trusted in the Lord, if you've never been able to trust his ways and just think that, I just don't know if they're for today, I challenge you to trust God. It's the only way to usher in security and hope amidst a world that just keeps running into walls. And if one thing that you walk away from this is just, maybe God is just wanting to show you your own vulnerability right now. Maybe through missteps and disobedience and other people's disobedience, it's just, life has just left you vulnerable. In your own heart, you're vulnerable. Or even clearly, you can see that there are things that are acting in opposition to you responding to God. So my challenge is, heed David's words to his son. His last dying words to his son before he went home. Live according to God's standards and protect the kingdom and all of its manifestations from its enemies. Do the work. Diagnose your own heart. See what is a challenger to the throne that Jesus is supposed to be on in your own heart. And share that with one another. Have others help you in that pursuit. So we need to respond to God. We can take David's words that he gave to Solomon and live them in our own lives. So let's go out of here and do that, okay? Let's pray.